Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to the first event of the tree planting community of practice on the GLFX platform. My name is Kimberly Merton from the Global Landscapes Forum, and I will be moderating this exclusive question and answer session with Susan Chomba and Lalisa Duguma, two leading scientists from World Agroforestry, which is also known as ICRAF. So this discussion is a follow-up to the successful September tree planting digital forum, where CIFOR-ICRAF and GLF brought scientists together along with forestry experts, community leaders, investors, and policymakers, all together to share insights and scientific evidence to important tree planting initiatives around the world. And in this exclusive Q&A, we would like to give you the opportunity to connect and engage with Susan and Lalisa, while also addressing some of the questions raised by participants during the forum. It was a very engaging conference and a very hot topic, and we thought this is a great opportunity to continue driving that momentum and that discussion on the GLFX Tree Planting Community of Practice platform. So I will start off by asking Susan and Lalisa one question, and you can post your follow-up questions in the chat so that we can kickstart a dynamic discussion. So please, I strongly urge you to post your follow-up questions in the chat, and then we can address them as we go along through this 1 hour. So I'll start off with Susan. Susan Chomba is a social scientist with over 15 years of experience in governance, policies, and institutions in forestry, agriculture, and rural development in Africa. Susan currently works at ICRAF, or World Agroforestry, where she runs projects on climate change, policies, land tenures, equity, vulnerability, and gender. So Susan, my first question, which comes from one of the chats in the Digital Tree Planting Forum, is, so when planning and implementing tree planting projects, what is the extent of government involvement, and how do we get private organizations involved in expanding the projects? Susan, you're welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, and a warm welcome to everybody who's joining us for this session today. The question on government involvement in tree planting programs is extremely important. I think we all work, or we all come from countries where we know that the governments are responsible for policy making, and therefore are a crucial partner in terms of really ensuring that we have conducive policies that will support the growing of trees in those countries. There are countries here in Africa that have really, the governments have really led the tree planting efforts. I'll give an example of countries like Rwanda, Ethiopia, with really huge targets in terms of tree planting, as well as very robust support in a country like Rwanda, really on ensuring that there are also not just policies, but also other infrastructure that are required for successful tree growing in those countries are available. So for instance, in Rwanda, there's a big government budget for tree planting, including support to tree planting groups, farmer associations at the local level, and tree growing, as well as nursery support of tree nursery support in terms of training through extension, government supported extension services. And this really makes any kind of tree planting program in Rwanda realize that it's really, there's very strong government support. And so I mentioned the aspect of policy in all countries, but also there's that kind of investment in terms of funding for tree planting, extension, government extension services, providing farmers with conducive local infrastructure, local institutions that can really foster that. So I think it's very important, even for programs that are working in countries where there's not a lot of government support, to engage with government officials, because you will need them in different areas, including really at the local entry level when you want to start up a program. Now, how do we ensure, or how do we bring in private sector engagement in tree planting? I think there's already a lot of, again, examples on the African continent where private sector have really immersed themselves in supporting tree planting as part of corporate social responsibility. And that's brilliant, farms that are really wanting to engage at the environmental level because they believe that they have a corporate social responsibility to ensure that the environment is not degraded, or where we have pollution, we are really acting towards that. But on the other hand, for the Regreening Africa program that I lead, we see private sector engagement in tree planting or tree growing or regeneration of degraded lands through tree-based value chains. And I'll give you an example quickly, Kimberly, before I just end my intervention. So I'll give you an example of some of the tree-based value chains that we've seen private sector, strong engagement of private sector. And this is in West Africa in commodities like shea butter, which come from trees, the Vitellaria paradoxa, which is a naturally growing tree in West Africa. And private sector is interested in ensuring that the products that are harvested from the shea tree are harvested in a sustainable way. And so there's investment in terms of restoring those trees, ensuring that the value chain, there's investment along the value chain from the production to the aggregation to the marketing by private sector, and offtake, of course, of the shea products to ensure that farmers are also getting a decent pay for the activities that they are involved in. So I think there are different ways that you can get private sector engagement, but I'd like to focus on those two, the corporate social responsibility element, as well as supporting tree-based value chains.
Thank you very much, Susan, for those insights on, yes, government and policies, but also the necessary infrastructure needed for that, and also, yes, CSR and sustainable tree-based initiatives. I'd like to turn over to Lalisa before I answer one of your questions from the chat. Lalisa Duguma has over a decade of experience in sustainable landscape management, agroforestry, natural resource management, integrated climate actions and policy analysis. And Lalisa also currently works at ICRAF, or the World Agroforestry, where he focuses on ecosystem-based adaptation, community-based resource management, tree-based energy systems, and sustainable environments in humanitarian settings. Lalisa, you are welcome. And my question to you from the participants at the Tree Planting Digital Forum is, so once all necessary infrastructure is in place, the government is involved, what do you see as the biggest hurdle in matching necessary finance to projects? So some popular answers throughout the digital forum included political hurdles, corruption, capitalism, and lack of cooperation. But yes, so what is, from your opinion and your work, the biggest hurdle in matching necessary finance to projects? Thank you. Lalisa, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks so much, Kimberly. And I also want to welcome every participant for this forum. But before I go to your question particularly, maybe I want to ask a question for all the audiences in this forum. Has anyone planted a tree before? You can just raise your hands or just put in the chat.
Lalisa, there are about, yes, yeah. 15 at least.
Yes, good. So the next question I have is, has the tree you planted or the trees you planted grown? Or has it died? Okay, I think there are quite a number of people who are giving response. Some are saying yes, some are saying most survived, others did not survive. I think when we talk about tree planting, we need to really understand what underlies this whole definition and the whole context. And the reason why I asked this question is we very often plant a lot of trees. By the way, we don't plant trees, we plant seedlings. Seedlings are that grow to become a tree. And what we forget very often is, what does it take for the tree to grow to become, for the seedling to grow and become the tree that we want? And the financing question you raised is really very relevant. And one word that caught my attention very seriously is the word that says committed. Very often we all commit to so many of these things. I mean, we have seen since 1992 when the UN Sustainable Development discussion has begun, there were quite a lot of investments on tree planting, tree growing, soil and water conservation and all those things. But did we see the results of those ones? Where are those investments taken us to? Where are those planted seedlings? Have they survived? So that really challenges what we call commitment in a way. And the very important question is that commitment just for the sake of committing yourself and being visible as a government or entity that wants to do green things, or is it an effective commitment?
Let's just give Lalisa maybe 30 seconds to reconnect. I'm sure you're all just as curious to hear.
Today we are losing ecosystems. That's why today we are losing so many of the resources that our livelihood actually depends on. The second point is we make commitments, but then there are factors which we can't control as a government, as an entity. Like, for instance, COVID is a very good example. So governments have to shift resources so that they cater for the most high priority things that they have to provide for their communities. So in those kinds of things, the right definition of what priority is becomes an interesting one. What is our priority? Is the priority a short-term priority, or is it a long-term priority? Or can we find a middle ground that accommodates our immediate needs, but also secures our future that we are going to depend on? Let's not only look at this financing issue also from an outward point of view. Somebody has to finance, entity X, government X, or NGO X has to finance. No, especially for those organizations and entities working on natural resource management, have we shown them if what we achieve at the end of the day, once they finance what is to happen? For instance, we ask resources for tree growing, resources for soil and water management and all those things. That's very good. Once they give, what are those right indicators that show difference both for those involved communities and also entities? Do we have a proper framing of those kinds of end products that they could see and get motivated or incentivized to do? An example that Suzanne brought is really an interesting one, the shea butter one. If people really realize what is coming out of this thing, I think we can attract financing for these kinds of interventions. So maybe let me stop there and then we can pick up questions that emerge from the discussion.
Thank you so much, Lalisa. So the importance of commitment, but also beyond that, and how important, yes, it is to focus on growing trees and not just planting trees, but look at the whole process. I see a question here, and it relates very well to what both of you said, and also I think you can provide interesting angles from your perspectives. Can planting of oil palms substitute tree planting? So maybe we can also broaden this question a little bit to plantation versus agroforestry. And maybe Susan, you can maybe highlight also the social impacts of such agroforestry systems or, yes, plantation systems, and whether it can substitute tree planting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. And well, I'll give it as an attempt, but I'd also like to get some support from Lalisa, especially because oil palm, and I hope most of the people who are listening here will be familiar with the history of oil palm and the unfortunate ecological consequences that oil palm plantations have had, especially in places where really they are replacing natural forests. So in that case, I think the answer is a categorical no. If oil palm plantation means replacing, the valuable indigenous, natural forests, then that should not even be an option that we should be considering. However, I also think that for farmers, smallholder farmers who are planting oil palm as part of, as part of their economic strategy, and especially in areas where, for instance, land is already degraded or in intensive agricultural land, and therefore there's sufficient integration of oil palm with other tree species that are really building the ecological stability of the farming system, then you can say that integration in that kind of a system is not necessarily good or bad. But I think for me, it's where oil palm is really coming to replace indigenous forests, the ecological consequences, even the consequences on the climate change when you lose all that carbon that is the trees and the biodiversity that is in the natural forest really is not worth the profits or the economics that come from oil palm growing.
Thank you, Susan. Lalisa, do you have something to add?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the question is growing oil palm replacing tree planting, or?
Yes, can oil palm substitute tree planting? Yeah.
Okay, I mean, Susan has rightly put it, and we all know there's so much negative stories behind oil palm. And to really look into those negative externalities associated with oil palm plantations, ICRAF in Brazil actually has come up with an agroforestry system that could actually reduce those negative externalities, such that there is that economic benefit with limited environmental impact. The major thing here is, okay, why do we do it, and what do we want to achieve? For instance, oil palm is a native plant in West Africa. Yeah. If people want to grow it without replacing the existing natural vegetation, and if it can generate livelihood income in an optimized way, because the biggest challenge we very often have is how do we optimize the different interests arising from the livelihoods aspect, from the environmental aspect, from the climate change aspects, and so many things. And if that oil palm planting could actually generate livelihood benefits, and by doing so, we can actually reduce the extent of deforestation that is happening because people are cutting down trees because they don't have alternative livelihoods, it should be part of the options. But when I say it should be part of the options, it should be followed by proper environmental assessment so that we don't actually magnify the impact rather than reducing its possible consequences on the ecosystem. So we need to really look at it from a context point of view. What is the context that we are looking at it? Because we can't generally or blindly say oil palm is bad, or we can't appreciate it so much, but it all depends on what is the environmental context, what is the social context, what is the economic context within which we are looking at the planting of those oil palm trees. And it also involves understanding the consequences, basically from the 3 dimensions that I have tried to allude to. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lalisa. I hope that answered your question. And if I may, I think I see a nice follow-up question to that. So especially related to globalization of such commodities. So although this event is an important way to integrate, how to achieve greater integration in forestry between the continents, for example, Africa and America, which have common institutions that work with forests and maybe also common trees and species. Is anyone volunteering, Lalisa or Susan?
I just need to read the question again.
Of course, Lalisa. I can also say it again. So it's just, have you got it?
No, it's in the long list, I think. So
no problem. So although this event is an important way to integrate, how to achieve greater integration in forestry between the continents, for example, Africa and America, which have common institutions that work with forests. And then maybe we can tie this into commodities and trees that are planted all around the world.
Yeah, I think it is the way we look at it. I mean, the commodities agenda has its own very complex setting within which it happens. Because if you really look at if I give you an example of cocoa, for example, the West Africa cocoa, people are clearing forests to produce a lot of the cocoa. And there are so many companies who are really trying to reduce that, and by incentivizing local communities not to actually cut the trees, but trying to find solutions that are environmentally friendly. Why I brought up this cocoa issue is because even though Africa produces a large part of the cocoa production globally, especially Cote d'Ivoire and those countries around that area, the value they get out of that commodity is quite small, because most of it is processed outside the country and the value addition does not happen within the country. So even if the production is happening within the country, that is the raw cocoa production, the seeds and the beans and all those things, there is the impact that comes from the consumption from out in a different continent. And that is having an impact in a broader sense on the whole ecology. That's why we need this one-hand approach to this whole environmental conservation, because if you are only going to it from a one-actor perspective, there is always a loophole which could have a significant detrimental effect on the whole success of the scheme. And Africa cannot alone manage the consequences of this cocoa-related deforestation. It needs the involvement of Europe, it needs the involvement of the US, America, and all these countries that are consuming and that are beyond the continent itself. That's why I think when we look at the tree planting, what is a good example is still the carbon agenda, which is bringing everybody to the same table. With the carbon, you can actually link it with any country that you think of, because all of us are emitters, but it is only the degree of emission that differs. So I think that global agenda approach to this whole scheme of environmental conservation is very critical, because the trade-offs associated with this silo approach or one country approach are really huge to manage if we don't consider it in the whole planning process. That's my perspective.
Thank you very much, Lalisa. Susan, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think Lalisa has done a fantastic job on shedding light on the political economy around the cocoa value chain. And I think that can also be said for other value chains, including shea, where we know that big private companies that are located in Europe or in China are the ones that are really, then using this, the final product for cosmetics and as well as food. I don't know how many of people here who are listening know that shea butter is actually used as a cocoa butter equivalent in making chocolates. And so probably without knowing or knowingly, you have consumed shea butter in your chocolate if you love chocolate like me. It's perfectly fine and it's a really, really good, natural product. But it's just that it's the global political economy really that Lalisa has pointed out, that we need to ensure that those of us who are consuming chocolates, those who really love natural products, we are aware that these products are coming from some of those landscapes that you see that are characterized not in the way that you're thinking in terms of the chocolates or in terms of the shea butter, but characterized in a way that they are degraded and there's probably nothing good that is coming from them. And we need to shift that narrative. We need to see these landscapes as productive landscapes, as landscapes that are providing really from both, survival and essential livelihood for people who are occupying the landscapes, as well as for really high-end products for people elsewhere. You know, we are consumers of that landscape, and being able to connect from wherever we are to that local landscape where our products are coming from is absolutely critical. I'd like also to mention about how we can also harness aspects of research across Africa, across Asia, across Europe, across, you know, Americas, in terms of understanding these landscapes. I think, as Lalisa mentioned, the beauty of us working in an international organization like CIFOR-ICRAF is that we have our colleagues who are working in other parts of in other continents, and there's always synergies in terms of understanding these dynamics. But this is not a luxury that is afforded in everybody. So I want to imagine researchers that are based in national research organizations in these countries. How do they link up with other researchers in other continents then that can be able to understand the dynamics that the person who's posed that question has asked, in terms of understanding species that are suited for the different places, policies, exchanging knowledge, exchanging innovations that can help us in terms of addressing land degradation in these continents. Last but not least is the role of government, and I don't want to overemphasize what Lalisa has mentioned, but there's also an element that I'd like to point, and maybe it could be asked during the finance section, but for me, it's the idea of that I've been seeing increasingly becoming popular, but not really in the mainstream. And this is the aspect of debt for nature swaps. And that is really based on the understanding that most of the landscapes that are providing some of the valuable tree-based products that we are using, including timber and non-timber forest products, these are coming from tropical countries, some of them extremely poor countries. And these countries are highly indebted, and they're expected to pay those debts. And for them to pay the debts, the most likely scenario is to continue with extractive activities like mining, extraction of oil, to be able to pay the debt that they owe to other countries. And so to be able to look at that aspects of debt for nature swap, so that these countries are obliged to be able to protect and look after nature, but then that is transferred into some of the debts that they have, could be an innovative mechanism of connecting the developing world with the developed world, and ensuring that we are coming up with innovative finance mechanisms that connects different spheres that we are currently working in. Thank you very much, Lalisa. And I do have a question, sorry, Susan, apologies. I do have a question for Lalisa, in fact, now that you pointed out to financing, and also for youth, but I think I will go with the finance questions once I've found it. Mm-hmm. No, actually, I can't find it. No, I can't find it. So I'll go with the one that's in the chat. Then I'm sure I'll find it somewhere, because it was a great question. So this question, Lalisa, over to you about technology. So a lot of the digital forum focused on technological innovations, and you touched upon this, Susan, as well. So how is technology helping you or us monitor, scale, and trace tree planting and value chains? And which do you recommend for nascent program developers?
Okay, thanks so much. I think that's a very interesting question, especially when it comes to the use and the environmental management issues. I know Susan has a very good answer, but she will come in later. But let me just first highlight some points. In the project that I'm leading in the Gambia, where we're looking at ecosystem restoration as the foundation for resilience or adaptive capacity building, we are doing quite a number of activities that really help not just us who are sitting far away from the place, but even the local communities to monitor what is happening within their landscapes or within their living areas. And one of those things, we call it ecosystem-based adaptation information platform. In this kind of framing, where we are just using very basic, not complicated, nothing. It's just very similar to Google Forms that most of us probably might be aware of. And farmers are actually inserting everything that is happening within their locality. We have people trained to the local village level so that they collect information. What is the kind of information that they collect? It's about when we plant trees, when we plant seedlings, sorry, have they survived? How much centimeter did they gain in 1 year? And all of those specific details. When is the inland water valley actually full? Inland water valley is like a depression within a landscape where water accumulates by itself. How deep it is and how long it stays within the landscape before drying, and all those kinds of minor things, minor looking like things. But what do they do? It is about the information coming to a central place to be processed. Very often when we talk about monitoring, we tend to complicate it. I think what we need to do is actually to more or less simplify it so that there is a cross understanding of what we mean when we say monitoring. Very often it gets to a point where the local communities do not even understand what is to be monitored. I can give you a simple example. When we talk about carbon stock, you can't stay in a village to monitor carbon stock, how much it has increased, or how you want to even tell to the communities. So I think simplification has to be the latest complication or complexity that we might be requiring, because very often we have gone to a level where there is some group which understands what is to be monitored, but there is a majority who do not even have a clue about what we are talking when we talk about monitoring. So technology is fundamental. GIS and remote sensing is really helping us a lot nowadays. One thing which I would like to mention is, for instance, NICFI, for instance, recently has made available open access maps or satellite imagery for anyone to utilize to monitor forest areas, degradation, specifically forest deforestation and all those issues. These are things we pull together. And the apps, I think Suzanne can say more about that, because she has, her project has come up with a very nice product that is quite widely used. Susan?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah. So the question on technology, I think people who've listened to me give various talks from GLF or University of Yale previously on the use of technology in land restoration, you'll know sometimes, so I think that technology is great and it's got its place in tree growing, as Lalisa has mentioned, as well as in various aspects of tree growing or land restoration in broad, because, let me make it clear that land restoration is bigger than tree growing. So you can restore land through various kind of practices and technology. So tree growing is only one aspect of it. We also use other practices such as natural regeneration, farmer-managed natural regeneration. We enhance other agroforestry practices such as soil and water conservation, and other methods. So restoration is bigger, but we are specifically focusing on tree growing. And tree growing is an important and critical component of land restoration when it is done and done properly. Now, what is the role of technology? I have been a bit hesitant for reasons that Lalisa has mentioned, in terms, especially when it comes to use of robots or other kind of high-tech technology in tree planting, and for various reasons. Especially for me, who's working with indigenous local communities and indigenous communities in lands that they own, in lands that they have rights to, I haven't really understood how use of, tree planting drones or other technological advancements can be done without infringing the rights of local communities in these lands. I imagine that for the proponents of use of drones, that these are in areas, for instance, public lands or gazetted forest lands that have clear rights, and there's a good discussion or engagement with governments who are possibly the ones who are responsible for restoring those areas. But even then, my question would be, what is the implications of that kind of an approach in a context where you have a lot of unemployed youth, labor that could be utilized, that could provide income and livelihood for people in restoring these areas, as well as creating a sense of ownership in the process of land restoration. So in that context, I have expressed my reservations, and I'm yet to see where high-end technology is used without infringing local people's rights, creating a sense of ownership and sustainability of these interventions at the local level in this context. But I have clearly mentioned that there are areas where there's no contested land rights, where there's no short supply of labor. In fact, if labor is a challenge, for instance, in developed countries where labor might be a problem, you don't have a lot of people to provide that labor, then that kind of an approach may actually be the right one. So just to mention what Lalisa said, it's options by context. We can't have a blanket one size fits all. We say we can just use drones because drones are super efficient, super effective, and they can plant millions of hectares in one day. My question is, but then what's the sustainability? What's the ownership? What about local rights to land and to tree resources in those areas? Yeah, so that's one thing. But in Regreening Africa, I've just put a summary there on the chat box. I've given you as well the page for the program that I lead across 8 countries in Africa. We have harnessed the power of technology in many ways, and not just us. There are other programs in Africa. I'm sure you might have heard about the Africa Tree Finder, which is fantastic. You can just search it, Africa Tree Finder ICRAF. And this is a mobile-based app that helps you to identify the different kind of tree species that you can be able to plant in different areas. And that really helps us in terms of ensuring that we are, again, not just promoting one or a few tree species. We understand which ones are the indigenous tree species, which are the exotic tree species, what are the products that we get from these tree species. And therefore, when you're negotiating with farmers and other landscape managers in terms of the kind of tree species we want to grow, then you understand which species are indigenous, what kind of products are farmers looking to get from different kind of tree species. I'm a forester myself, but from the tropics, we have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of tree species. And so when we talk about tree diversity, it's always a challenge in terms of understanding which kind of tree species should we be matching for the different ecological niches, but also for to meet the demands and the needs of the farmers. So a mobile-based app that helps us to be able to make those kind of decisions, to me, is absolutely useful. Secondly, and last, I'd like to pinpoint on the aspect of monitoring, where we are using the Regreening Africa app. It's freely available on Google Play. You can check it out. And we developed it, and we are still developing it. It's not the end of its development. We are constantly adapting it to try and use it for monitoring, especially the areas that we are trying to restore. And by using that app and combining it with big data analytics, we are able to see a lot in terms of not just the vegetation cover, which is what a lot of monitoring programs do. They are monitoring, like using Collect Earth, you can be able to see the changes in vegetation, but we want to go beyond that. For the Regreening Africa app, we are able to combine what we are getting with aspects such as soil quality, soil organic carbon, soil erosion prevalence. And so as we grow trees, how are these soil dynamics changing? And then how is the vegetation changing? And what are the trade-offs in terms of having that kind of vegetation cover and other kind of land use systems or land use practices that we have? So I think that technology is fantastic. We need to know when and how we are using it, for whom. But the point that Lalisa made is absolutely critical. We should ensure that it's not leading to exclusion, especially of local communities. And what I mean by exclusion, it's exclusion in terms of technology. So technologically, if they don't understand what we are doing, then it's absolutely not worth it. Exclusion in terms of economic exclusion, if it means taking that labor that they would provide and sell that labor and be able to earn a livelihood, then I think that that's a very negative trade-off there. And exclusion socially as well. If you come in a village in Africa and you have your drone and you're flying it around, and you're really not, it's not even something that has been discussed and engaged with local communities to understand what is happening. It's just something that is not socially embedded. It is not going in accordance with the local norms. Then I think again there's a problem there. So I think in summary, that's what I would say about use of technology in tree growing and restoration efforts.
Just one last point, Kimberly. Sorry, I know time is gone.
No, of course. Go for it, Lalisa. All yours.
Yeah, I mean, very often we do quite a lot of research. We do monitoring first year baseline, then it continues. But the most amazing thing that we often do, either intentionally or unintentionally, is that we go and collect this information, or we do this monitoring from the local landscape where people are living, where communities are depending on it. And we don't actually tell them what happened with the data. These people who are the owners, who are the residents of the landscape, let me put it very in a capital word, RIGHT. They have the right to know what came out of the data that we collect or the monitoring process that we implement. This is the missing element in most of the things we basically do. And I really want to put forward this good practice to give back to the community what came out of the data that they were involved in when you were collecting, or that they were doing, where that they were helping you to collect. Even if it is on their own property, they have the right to know what the result of that process is. Just as any scientist, we always want to see what came out of my work, either in a publication format, in a citation format, and all those things. These communities, for them, it is even more than those kinds of attributes. It is about their life. It's about their livelihood. It's about their future. So they have the right to know what came out of what you did in their landscape. So let's not forget to go back to the communities and tell them, when we were collecting all this data, we were aiming to do this. And now here is the outcome. So you can actually see the difference. And this is why we were doing this for this purpose. Just wanted to highlight that point on the monitoring. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lalisa and Susan. And I think you also care more about the citations on your papers when you're doing your research, and you've clearly highlighted that. Yes, that was really inspiring, and I see in the chat a lot that you've both inspired a lot of people on the importance of being responsible when using technology and rooting it locally in the landscape. So thank you very much for that. I also believe that Matthew Cohorst, that we've kind of answered your question here previously about how one can reduce the risk of invasive alien species. So, you know, locally rooted, speak to the people, understand the area, look at the ecological niches, and that these apps have a great prospects of doing that. I'm just scrolling through the app, and I'd also like to share, yes, from Katya as well. Thank you, Susan, if you haven't seen this. And Irini is also very inspired by both of you. And yes, they all find it super helpful. I'm just also catching up with the chat. So I am also seeing a comment here. Knowing what happens with the data is also a huge factor in the trust and relationships. And maybe we can elaborate a little bit on that. The trust and relationships projects are usually quite short term. And I liked your comment, Lalisa, of negotiating the immediate and the future sort of goals. So in your experience then, how do you build such trust and relationships when you go about tree planting initiatives or restoration initiatives? Maybe we go back to Susan and then over to you, Lalisa, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, building trust in tree growing programs. I think, you know, borrowing again from Regreening Africa, and I have to give due credit, you know, to all the partners of Regreening Africa. These insights that I share broadly are purely because of the work that our partners, you know, development partners such as World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, CRS, CARE, Sahel-ICO. These are development partners, but also we work very closely with government institutions at the local, subnational, and local level. And of course, you know, CIFOR-ICRAF in providing technical and scientific support to this program. So I'm not trying to take credit on my own, but I'd like to say in terms of building trust, we work, you know, as, and I'll say for us as a research organization, our mandate is not to do development. And so we work with partners whose mandate is that, and they have long outstanding relationship with local communities and with government institutions. It doesn't mean that it's a perfect model. You could also work directly with farmer groups. But I think one of the key aspects of building trust for us is to really, at the onset of a program, to have a shared vision of what each of the stakeholders that is engaged in the program is expecting out of by the end of the program. So we don't assume that our objectives necessarily are completely in line with the objectives of the government, with the objectives of the local communities. I think it's understanding that different stakeholders in a landscape will have different objectives. You might engage with an actor whose primary objective for land restoration is sequestering carbon. It's not a bad objective, but you might also work with another stakeholder or local communities whose primary objectives is actually to put food on the table. Every time you have a discussion around planting trees or restoring the landscape, the question is, but how is that going to help me put food on my table, educate my children? These are the primary objectives. And so for us, building trust is to have a transparent process that tries to understand the different objectives of the different stakeholders that are involved in that landscape that we are trying to restore. And by having an open engagement process, so if a project is primarily funded as, for instance, a REDD+ project or a project on carbon sequestration, it's then to understand how can carbon sequestration not impede or become an impediment for the local communities who are interested in livelihood, in meeting their livelihood goals. How can it not become an impediment for another actor who may be engaged, whose primary objective is to see biodiversity in that landscape flourish? Some of these objectives usually do have these synergies between some of these objectives, but not all the time. Sometimes we have to understand that there are trade-offs between these objectives, and having a clear, transparent process in the beginning of understanding what are the synergies and what are the trade-offs and how can we be able to manage these trade-offs. That will be the most important thing for us to be able to have a process of mutual trust throughout the program implementation. So in Regreening Africa, for instance, when we talk about tree-based value chains, we understand that if we create a big demand for some of these tree products, for shea, for ziziphus, or for moringa, or for baobab, if you create a very high demand, but you're not looking at the aspects of sustainability, increasing the trees and ensuring that there's protection of the trees that these products are coming from, you can have a place where you actually exhaust these resources. So on one hand, probably you're scoring very high on livelihood objectives if there's a lot of extraction and there's a lot of income that is coming back to the community, but you're probably leading to loss of biodiversity if all the seeds and all the leaves of these products are extracted and there's no natural regeneration or there's no effort to restore those areas with those trees. So so that is, for me, is absolutely critical. But of course, it's very, very also important to have credible research, credible data that is helping us to be able to answer these questions, not just because we want to push a certain agenda, but because we are collecting credible data and discussing it with the stakeholders throughout the process to ensure that we are understanding how the program is impacting or is leading to different goals, how we are having any kind of trade-offs, and how we are managing those trade-offs within the program. And so the point that Lalisa made is absolutely critical. Having data that is being discussed openly, credible data collected without any kind of a bias, but also ensuring that it is constantly discussed and used to inform the program implementation process.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susan, for that. And then maybe Lalisa, in your response, can you also try and capture Sylvia's question here about the challenges with local communities when invasive species are brought to the table? I think that also relates quite closely to the transparent process and trust. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Susan has done a fabulous job in explaining the whole thing about trust, but let me just say 2 points. Yeah, trust is about understanding one another, and the biggest limitation we have in these kinds of settings is that we forget that local communities are the most important partners of what we do, because they are the ones who live in the landscape. They are the ones who dwell within the confines of what the landscape could provide. We go there for projects. When the project ends, we are gone. But those people are there. They live in it with the consequences or with the positive outcomes of whatever we do. So the first point that needs to be clear, as very nicely said by Susan, is really to put on the table all the things in an open discussion forum, not with our partners who are coming in from different institutions. The most critical one, if we really want to gain the trust of the community, is to start with them. And there is one example that I want to give you here. We often say the right species for the right place for the right purpose. So who defines that right? Yeah. We are not planting in our office. We are not planting in our houses, but we are planting it out there, especially when we do development projects or research projects. So the right to define that right belongs to those people who dwell with the consequences of what we do out there. And that is what we need to really bring into the discussion of trust and understanding. If you define it for them and take it to them, it is like, I know for you. But if you begin to ask them what is the problem and what do you think are the solutions, then communities begin to feel that, oh, you value what we know. And this is actually where the knowledge as a whole begins, or whether our understanding, I mean, basically where our understanding of the landscape begins. Let's not forget that knowledge or science actually starts with all this process of understanding from the ground, which is very often based on the indigenous science or local knowledge, the way we basically call it. So I think if we want to gain trust, if we want to build trust, the most critical thing is we need to be in the shoes of the other partner or community that is going to live with this consequence and see it in the view they view the things we are to do in the landscape. That now gives us the platform where we can discuss openly and where they can open for you to tell you that what is right to do in their view is X, Y, Z. Not what you come up with the science alone. Science is there to support. Science is not there to guide what they want within their landscape. That's, I think, one definition or one context we all need to really capture very well when we think about community engagement, working with communities, and so on. The other point is projects are projects. They can be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. All of us, once the projects we are leading are done, they are left to the communities. And in this process, I think the most critical thing is, okay, how do we build their capacity? Because if you just go and do things and go, the knowledge and the understanding goes with you as a project setting. But if you begin to train local communities, local people who are living within the landscape, then there is that knowledge cross-hybridization, the local knowledge and also the scientific knowledge or the research-based knowledge or evidence-based knowledge that you bring into the landscape. So I think when we talk about trust, there are lots of things, but let me just stop it there and discuss about the invasive species. This brings me to the agenda of why do we do what we do? Yeah, why are we doing what we are doing? That's the first important question we all need to ask ourselves, starting from myself, every one of us who are going out there to do things. If you really want to see a green landscape, let me just give you a hypothetical scenario. Yeah, if you want to see a very green landscape in the highlands of Ethiopia, you can just move around, identify areas with a very good rainfall amount, relatively deep soil, and plant all of the area with eucalyptus. Because in 3 years, the whole landscape will be green. Yeah. Because your objective is actually to have a green landscape. And it is the same context. I mean, this is really important, because if our framing of the goal of what we do is not right, the whole thing is not right. Yeah. And we are all distorted, because we are in fact magnifying the amplitude of the trade-off generation within the landscape than solving the problems of the communities. And in this context, when it comes to trust issues and the invasive species agenda, that's how we see in, especially in East Africa, I'm not mentioning names of countries, but we have a huge commitment to plant trees, the way it is called. Yeah, we call it tree growing, seedling growing, whatever it is. But when you go around the nurseries, what you see is the most dominant species that you see is number one, eucalyptus. Number two, gravilia. Number three, all of these things. None of it actually looks at how do we make sure these species can actually enhance the sustainability of the areas where we are going to plant or grow them. You can achieve what you want depending on the design you want to follow. Yeah. And that's where the invasive species, you can go and tell to the communities you are going to restore the landscape or the degraded areas. You can plant eucalyptus, you can plant, even prosopis could do the best job actually without needing too much investment, because it is a very invasive species. If you hide these details from the local communities and put them into that intervention, and they will follow you to do it, at the end of the day, when your project ends, you have gone, but the people have to live with it. So openness in terms of telling what the consequences, because very often what we do is we want to tell people the positive side, and because we want to be accepted by, we want them to say, oh, welcome, and we can do this together. We need to be very frank to ourselves, put the positives and the negatives on the table so that they know and they can actually decide on what they want. That is actually where trust needs to be brought into the discussion. And that's just a few points from my point.
Thank you so much, Lalisa. We're unfortunately on the hour already, and I didn't really give us 2 minutes for that. I would just like to give Susan maybe 30 seconds for anything final from your end before I quickly wrap up.
Yeah, I would feel very sad if I didn't say something to the question that has been asked by Pascal as well as asked by Mr. Rawat on land tenure issues, which are absolutely critical in terms of ensuring that we have sustainable land restoration models. There's a lot of research that is going into this, and I think, if you link up with the GLF team from CIFOR-ICRAF team, we can share with you a lot of research that is going into addressing aspects of land tenure. But they're absolutely critical that if we don't address them, then I think the aspect of community rights, the aspects of exclusion, the aspects of sustainability cannot be addressed unless we address the land tenure issues. I think there's a lot that is going on in terms of trying to clarify tenure, trying to ensure that there's a secure tenure rights, but also in places where those do not exist, what options do we have for restoration? So it's not an easy question, but I think it's absolutely critical, and we are looking at it, and we can share more in terms of scientific articles that have informed this subject on restoration. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Susan. Lalisa, I'm seeing your hand. I'm going to get in trouble, but please, you have another 30 seconds.
No, because one of the questions that was asked on the GLF is about the use involvement, yeah? And I think the biggest gap that we have at the moment is we talk about tree planting. When we talk about tree planting, it's not about today, it is about the future. And the future belongs to the youth. But are they on the platform to make decisions about these things? Are they involved in the discussions? I don't personally think it is fair that they have to fight to have a voice in this discussion. It is their right to have a voice in this discussion, yeah? And we need to give them space. It is about them. And there is this negative connotation, which is really broadened in the African context, which I can talk very confidently about, that youth are not interested in agriculture or land-related activities. No, that is not true. One, we have not shown them that it can work. Two, they don't have that mentality. It is because they don't have the options that they are being brought to that level of discussion. The last point which I want to say, which is really to dismantle this negative connotation about the youth and environment, is that nobody wants to have a broken home going forward. It is the same kind of approach that our youth have. So let's give them the platform, let's engage them. It is not a choice, it is a right, because the future is about them. The future is not about today, it is tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Lalisa. I think both of you in your reflections have summarized quite nicely the whole conversation and tied it into the sort of fundamentals of all initiatives, and that it's, yes, it does boil down to the local communities and their rights and negotiating those interests there. So thank you for making that point, and I won't say any more to it. I would just like to thank you all for joining us here today and sparking this great conversation and being so active in the chat. And we're thrilled to have you on board this tree planting community of practice on the GLFX platform. And I do hope that you sign up and register, and that is the place to continue this conversation. As Susan mentioned, from the CIFOR-ICRAF and GLF team, we will post all of the science that we have at our sort of disposal and in our knowledge hubs onto the community of practice to keep it going. The community of practice is an organic movement, so please, feel free to share the knowledge and insights, spark the conversation yourselves, and we urge you to stay on it. And we will host a networking session on the 5th of November as another opportunity for us to engage in more deep conversations and get to know one another. So I'll say that again, on the 5th of November, we'll have another networking session on the tree planting COP. And also, last but not least, I hope to see you in 2 weeks' time at our GLF Biodiversity Conference on October 28th and 29th. We'll have biodiversity experts, scientists, policymakers, journalists, activists, private sector, indigenous groups, the whole shebang. And I can assure you that we do have them, because now we're 2 weeks away. And yes, this is the GLF Biodiversity Digital Conference with the theme of One World, One Health. So I really hope to see you there. Thank you, Lalisa and Susan, again for your time. And yes, see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, thanks.